Today, we will experience an emotional and meaningful story titled A Police Officer Humiliates a Black Woman, unaware she's his new boss's wife. The story revolves around an arrogant cop abusing his authority and a strong woman who makes him pay dearly. Witness how justice is served in an unexpected way. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more meaningful stories. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more meaningful stories. Steve Miller, a white patrol officer, confidently drove through the streets of a bustling city. His eyes gleamed with self-satisfaction, a sense of power that no one could challenge. To Steve, his police uniform symbolized absolute authority, and he relished the fear that others felt when they saw him. He believed himself untouchable, someone who could make the rules and break them at will. His power, in his own mind, was unquestionable. As he cruised along the crowded streets, his eyes caught sight of a sleek, black luxury car speeding by. It was going faster than it should have been. Without much thought, Steve turned on his siren and accelerated to catch up. He had found his target. The car was a high-end model, a car he believed had no place in this neighborhood unless it was up to something shady. He felt a surge of excitement, a chance to flaunt his authority. When the luxury car finally pulled over, Steve stepped out of his patrol car with the swagger of someone who believed the entire street belonged to him. He adjusted his belt, making sure his gun was clearly visible, the ultimate symbol of his authority. He approached the car window and knocked on it, harder than necessary, intending to make whoever was inside feel a surge of fear. Slowly, the window rolled down, revealing a woman behind the wheel. She was black, elegantly dressed, her gaze steady and unflinching. Steve was taken aback for a moment. He had expected to see fear, anxiety, or at least some kind of nervousness. Instead, he was met with calmness and confidence, a combination that irritated him. The woman, whose name was Angela, met his eyes without flinching, her face showing no signs of being intimidated. Steve didn't like this one bit. "License and registration," he said, his tone dripping with disdain. He looked at Angela as if she were out of place, as if she had no right to be driving such an expensive car through this neighborhood. Angela, keeping her movements deliberate, reached into her bag and handed over her documents. Her hands didn't shake. Steve noticed this, and it annoyed him even more. He wanted her to be scared. He wanted to see her intimidated by his presence. He looked over the documents longer than necessary, his eyes moving slowly across the paper as though he were trying to find some mistake, something that would justify his decision to stop her. He couldn't find anything. Everything was in order. He glanced at Angela, then at the car and sneered. "This car yours?" he asked, his voice thick with sarcasm. "A woman like you driving a car like this?" Angela held his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Yes, officer, it's mine. I bought it with my money," she replied, her tone calm but firm. There was a quiet challenge in her words, a defiance that Steve wasn't used to. He frowned, feeling his temper flare. He stepped closer, leaning into the window, making sure she could see the authority he carried on his belt. "You know, people like you don't usually belong in neighborhoods like this," he said, his eyes narrowing. "Maybe you're doing something you shouldn't be." Angela's eyes flashed briefly, but she stayed composed. "People like me?" she asked, her voice still calm. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Her question hung in the air, the challenge unmistakable. Steve sneered, ignoring her question. He didn't need to explain himself. He was the one in control here, or at least he thought so. He looked her up and down, trying to find something, anything, to use against her. When he found nothing, his frustration grew. He wasn't used to this. He was used to seeing fear, to having people submit to his authority without question. Angela wasn't giving him that satisfaction. "Where do you work?" he asked, changing tactics. "Maybe I should call your employer, check if you're telling the truth. It wouldn't be the first time I caught someone making up stories around here." Angela took a breath, her patience clearly being tested. "I'm an attorney," she said. "I work at Benson and Leon on Main Street. You can call them if you want." Steve recognized the firm's name immediately. It was one of the most prestigious law firms in the city. He hadn't expected that answer, and it only made him more frustrated. She wasn't intimidated, and worse, she was someone important, someone who could make trouble for him. "An attorney, huh?" he muttered, trying to regain control of the situation. "You must be one of those who think they're above the law." He stepped back from the car, holding her documents for a moment longer before shoving them back to her. "Just watch yourself," he said, his voice full of forced authority. "People like you can get into trouble real fast." Angela took her documents, her expression still calm. "Am I free to go, officer?" she asked, her voice cutting through his attempts to intimidate her. Steve hesitated for a moment, then nodded, waving her off dismissively. He watched as she drove away, the taillights of her car disappearing down the street. A strange feeling settled in his chest. Anger mixed with something else, something he couldn't quite name. As Steve got back into his patrol car, he felt an unsettling unease. It wasn't an unusual stop, but something about the encounter had shaken him. He gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to push the feeling away. He didn't know that Angela was the wife of his new boss, Captain Marcus Thompson, and he certainly didn't know that this encounter would soon bring consequences he never imagined. After Angela returned home, she recounted the entire incident to her husband, Captain Marcus Thompson. Marcus, who had recently been appointed as Steve Miller's new superior, listened attentively, his expression hardening with every detail Angela shared. Marcus had always prided himself on upholding justice and protecting the integrity of the police force. Hearing how one of his own officers had treated his wife filled him with a cold fury. That night, Marcus sat in his study, thinking over the best course of action. He knew he had to handle the situation with both authority and caution. Steve Miller needed to understand the gravity of his actions, not just as a police officer abusing power, but also as a man who had crossed a dangerous line. Marcus decided that Steve would need a wake-up call, one that he wouldn't soon forget. The next morning, Steve was summoned to Captain Marcus Thompson's office. He had no idea what was waiting for him. To Steve, it was just another day. He walked through the precinct with his usual swagger, nodding to his colleagues as if he owned the place. When he reached the captain's office, he knocked on the door and entered, still completely unaware of the storm brewing for him. Marcus sat behind his desk, his face expressionless as Steve stepped inside. "You wanted to see me, sir?" Steve asked, standing at attention but with an air of casual indifference. Marcus gestured for him to sit, his eyes never leaving Steve's face. The silence in the room was thick, and Steve began to sense that this wasn't just a routine meeting. "Officer Miller," Marcus began, his voice calm but carrying a weight that made Steve sit up straighter. "I want to discuss an incident that took place yesterday afternoon. Specifically, a traffic stop you conducted in the Pine Hill neighborhood." Steve felt a slight twinge of unease but quickly dismissed it. He tried to keep his face neutral as Marcus continued. "You stopped a black luxury car driven by a woman named Angela Thompson," Marcus said, his tone sharpening. Steve blinked, a sense of recognition hitting him. He nodded slowly, his mouth suddenly dry. "Yes, sir. The driver seemed suspicious, so I pulled her over," Steve said, trying to sound confident. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his eyes locked on Steve. The captain's silence was deafening. "Suspicious?" Marcus repeated, his voice betraying no emotion. "What exactly led you to believe that Mrs. Thompson was doing anything suspicious?" Steve hesitated, his mind scrambling for an answer that sounded legitimate. "Well, sir, she was speeding, and, considering the neighborhood, I thought it best to check things out," he said, forcing himself to hold Marcus's gaze. Marcus remained silent for a long moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. The tension in the room was palpable, and Steve could feel sweat starting to form at the back of his neck. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice colder than before. "Officer Miller, I am well aware of the discretion officers have during traffic stops. However, what I am not willing to tolerate is abuse of that discretion, especially when it comes with the type of language and behavior you demonstrated yesterday. Steve opened his mouth to protest, but Marcus raised a hand, cutting him off. I am not finished, he said, his voice firm. Steve closed his mouth, his unease now turning into full-blown anxiety. Marcus continued, Mrs. Thompson, as you may have figured out by now, is my wife. But even if she weren't, your conduct was unacceptable. You treated her with disrespect, with an attitude that suggests you believe some people are less deserving of courtesy simply because of how they look or where they are. Steve's heart sank. He could feel the walls closing in, the realization hitting him like a ton of bricks. He had messed up badly. Marcus stood, his imposing figure making Steve feel smaller in his chair. From this point forward, Officer Miller, your actions will be under strict scrutiny. Every stop you make, every decision you take will be monitored closely. You will not get away with abusing your authority again. If you so much as step out of line, you will answer to me directly, and I assure you there will be consequences. Steve nodded, his throat too dry to speak. The confidence he had carried with him for so long was slipping away, replaced by a gnawing sense of vulnerability. Marcus continued, the badge you wear is not a free pass to harass or intimidate. It is a responsibility to serve and protect every member of this community without bias or prejudice. Do I make myself clear? Yes, sir. Steve finally managed to say, his voice barely above a whisper. Marcus stared at him for a moment longer before nodding. You're dismissed, Officer Miller. Remember what I said. Steve stood, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. He walked out of the office, his head spinning. As he moved through the precinct, the usual nods from his colleagues felt different, like they were watching him, like they knew. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Steve tried to focus on his tasks, but Marcus's words echoed in his mind. He felt exposed, like a spotlight was now shining directly on him, highlighting every flaw, every mistake. The power he had once wielded so confidently now felt like a burden, something that could be taken away at any moment. That evening, Steve sat alone in his apartment, replaying the events of the day in his head. He had always thought of himself as untouchable, as someone who could do whatever he wanted without consequence. But now, that illusion was shattered. He realized that his actions had real consequences, not just for the people he targeted, but for himself as well. He thought about Angela, the way she had looked at him without fear, the way she had refused to be intimidated. It made him uncomfortable, but it also made him think. For the first time, Steve began to question himself, to wonder if maybe, just maybe, he had been wrong. The authority he held wasn't meant to be a weapon against those he deemed unworthy. It was supposed to be a shield, a means to protect and serve. But had he ever really used it that way? The next day at the precinct, Steve found himself more cautious. He went about his duties with a sense of unease, aware of every move he made, every word he spoke. He noticed Marcus watching him from time to time, the captain's gaze a constant reminder of the warning he had received. The swagger that had once defined Steve's walk was gone, replaced by a careful, almost hesitant step. His colleagues seemed to notice the change, some of them giving him curious glances, others whispering when they thought he wasn't paying attention. Steve felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. The judgment, the scrutiny, the knowledge that one wrong move could end his career. He was no longer the untouchable officer he had once believed himself to be. He was vulnerable, and it scared him. As days passed, Steve tried to adjust to his new reality. He kept his head down, did his job without drawing attention to himself, and avoided any situations that might lead to another confrontation. But the unease never left him. It lingered, a constant reminder of how quickly everything could change, how easily power could slip through his fingers. He had thought he was above it all, that he could do as he pleased without consequence. But now, Steve Miller was learning the hard way that no one was truly untouchable, and that the cost of abusing power was far greater than he had ever imagined. Captain Marcus Thompson decided to give Steve Miller one final chance, a new mission that could redeem him and save his career. The assignment was a dangerous one. Steve had to go undercover and infiltrate a drug trafficking network that had connections within the police force. It was a perilous task that required Steve to assume the role of a new recruit within the organization, working alongside Tony, a seasoned undercover cop who had already established himself in the network. Steve was given little time to prepare. The following evening, he met Tony in a discreet, dimly lit bar tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. Tony was sitting at a table in the back, his eyes sharp and scanning the room as Steve approached. Tony had the look of a man who had been through hell and back, a worn leather jacket, a rugged face lined with experience, and eyes that held a wary, calculating edge. He waved Steve over, nodding at the empty chair across from him. Steve sat down, trying to mask his nervousness. He could feel the weight of the assignment pressing down on him, but he knew this was his only shot at proving himself. Tony leaned forward, his voice low as he began to speak. "Look, Miller, this isn't like any regular job. One wrong move, one wrong word, and we're both dead. These people don't mess around. They trust no one, and they have eyes everywhere." He paused, letting the words sink in. "If you want to survive, you need to be ready to think on your feet. No hesitation, no second guessing. You do what I say when I say it. Got it?" Steve nodded, his throat dry. "Yeah, I got it," he replied, his voice sounding more uncertain than he intended. Tony studied him for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I hope so, because once you're in, there's no getting out until it's over. And trust me, it's not going to be pretty." Tony took a sip of his drink, his gaze never leaving Steve's face. "We're meeting some of the key players tomorrow night. I'll introduce you as a guy looking to make some quick cash, someone who's willing to do whatever it takes. You keep your mouth shut and let me do the talking. Understand?" Steve nodded again, the gravity of the situation settling heavily in his chest. He had thought he understood what going undercover meant, but sitting here, listening to Tony, he realized just how dangerous this mission truly was. There would be no room for mistakes. The stakes were higher than anything he had ever faced before. He had to not only play the role but become it, fully immersing himself in a world of criminals, lies, and constant danger. The next night, Steve found himself standing outside a rundown warehouse on the outskirts of the city. The place was dimly lit, shadows stretching long across the cracked pavement. Tony was beside him, his face expressionless as they waited for the door to open. After what felt like an eternity, the door creaked open, revealing a tall, imposing figure. The man eyed them suspiciously before stepping aside to let them in. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and tension. A few men sat around a table, their eyes immediately locking on to Steve. Tony stepped forward, his voice casual but confident. "This is Miller," he said, jerking his thumb in Steve's direction. "He's looking to make some quick cash, and he's got the guts to do whatever needs doing." The men at the table eyed Steve, their gazes hard and unforgiving. One of them, a burly man with a scar running down his cheek, stood up and approached him. "Let's see if you've got what it takes," the man said, his voice a low growl. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small bag of white powder. "Take this to the address on this note," he said, handing Steve a slip of paper. "And don't even think about screwing up. We'll know." Steve took the bag and the note, nodding. His heart was pounding, but he kept his face neutral, trying not to show any sign of fear or hesitation. As they left the warehouse, Tony glanced at Steve, his expression unreadable. "Remember what I told you," he said quietly. "No mistakes." Steve nodded, the weight of the mission pressing down on him even more heavily now. He knew that every step he took from this point on would be a test, not just of his skills as a cop, but of his ability to survive in a world that was completely foreign to him. The address on the note led them to a decrepit apartment building in a part of town Steve rarely visited. The kind of place where the law felt distant and people lived by their own rules. Tony stayed in the car, watching the surroundings while Steve went inside. He climbed the narrow staircase, each creak of the old wood echoing in the empty corridor. When he reached the door, he knocked twice, as instructed. The door opened just a crack, and a pair of eyes peered out. After a moment, the door swung open, and Steve was pulled inside roughly. The room was dark, the only light coming from a flickering bulb in the corner. A man stood in front of him, eyeing the bag in Steve's hand. "You got the stuff?" he asked, his voice raspy. Steve nodded, handing over the bag. The man took it, inspecting it briefly before nodding. "Good. Now get out." Steve turned and left, his heart pounding as he made his way back down the stairs. Every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, to get out of there as fast as he could. But he knew he couldn't. He had to stay calm, had to prove that he could handle this. When he got back to the car, Tony gave him a nod. "Good job," he said, starting the engine. "But don't get comfortable. This was just the beginning." Over the next few days, Steve found himself getting deeper and deeper into the network. Each task they gave him was more dangerous than the last, pushing him further out of his comfort zone. He had to deliver packages, collect money, and even intimidate people who had crossed the organization. Each time, he felt a piece of his old self slipping away, replaced by the persona he had to adopt to survive. Tony was always there, watching, guiding him when necessary, but never stepping in unless it was absolutely critical. Steve could tell that Tony was testing him, seeing if it what it took to not only survive, but to gain the trust of the network. It was exhausting, physically, mentally, and emotionally. The constant fear of being discovered, of making one wrong move, was like a weight pressing down on him at all times. One night, after a particularly tense meeting with one of the higher-ups in the organization, Steve and Tony sat in the car, the silence between them heavy. Finally, Tony spoke. "You're doing well, Miller. Better than I expected. But don't let your guard down. These guys, they're always watching. The moment they think you're not one of them, you're dead. Remember that." Steve nodded, the reality of Tony's words sinking in. He was in too deep now. There was no turning back. As they drove away, Steve looked out the window, the city lights blurring past. He had wanted a chance to prove himself, to make up for his mistakes. But now, as he found himself sinking deeper into the darkness of the criminal underworld, he wondered if he would ever truly escape it, or if this mission would end up consuming him entirely. Steve and Tony arrived at the abandoned warehouse just before midnight. The place was isolated, with rusting metal sheets creaking in the wind and the eerie sound of water dripping from the ceiling. The dim lights hanging above flickered, casting long shadows that seemed to dance across the concrete floor. The air was heavy with tension, a suffocating mixture of mistrust and danger. They were there to meet Jake and some of the other key players in the drug trafficking network, but Steve couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. Jake, one of the leaders of the network, eyed Steve the moment he walked in. Jake was a tall, burly man with an aura that exuded suspicion. His eyes were dark and calculating, and his face was scarred, a testament to the life he had led. He watched Steve like a hawk, his gaze never leaving him for a second. Steve could feel Jake's mistrust, the weight of it pressing down on him like an invisible hand squeezing his throat. The warehouse was filled with men, some of them busy moving crates, others standing around, guns visible in their waistbands. Tony walked ahead, giving Steve a slight nod as if to remind him to keep his cool. They approached a group of men standing around a table in the center of the warehouse. Jake stood at the head of the table, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. Tony introduced Steve again, reminding everyone that he was the new recruit. Jake looked Steve up and down, his lips curling into a half-smile that didn't reach his eyes. "So, Miller," Jake began, his voice low and rough, "you want to make a name for yourself here, huh?" Steve nodded, keeping his face as neutral as possible. "Yeah, I'm here to do whatever needs to be done," he replied, trying to project confidence. Jake's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. He took a step closer, his eyes boring into Steve's. "That's so? Let's see if you've got what it takes." He gestured to one of his men, who brought over a metal case and placed it on the table. Jake opened it, revealing several bags of drugs and stacks of cash. "I need you to take care of something for me," Jake said, his eyes still locked on Steve's. "There's a drop happening tonight, and I want you to handle it. But first—" Jake's eyes narrowed, and his voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "I want to know who you really are." He leaned closer, his face just inches from Steve's. "You see, I don't trust people easily, and something about you doesn't sit right with me." The entire warehouse seemed to go quiet, the tension building to an unbearable level. Steve could feel his pulse pounding in his ears. He had to stay calm. One wrong word, one wrong move, and he was dead. "I'm just a guy trying to make some money," Steve said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping his insides. "I got nothing to lose, and I'm willing to do whatever it takes." Jake stared at him for a long moment, his eyes searching Steve's face for any hint of deceit. Finally, he stepped back, nodding slowly. "All right, we'll see about that." He motioned to his men, who closed the metal case and handed it to Steve. "Take this to the address on the card. And remember, I'm watching you." Steve took the case, nodding, and glanced at Tony, who gave him a subtle nod of encouragement. They turned to leave, but before they could reach the exit, a distant sound echoed through the warehouse, the unmistakable wail of police sirens. Steve's heart skipped a beat. The sirens grew louder, and panic spread across the room. Jake's eyes flashed with fury, and he immediately turned toward Steve, his suspicion boiling over into outright accusation. "You set us up, didn't you?" Jake shouted, his hand moving to his gun. The men around the warehouse began to scramble, some drawing their weapons, others rushing towards the exits. Chaos erupted, the once quiet warehouse now filled with shouts and the clattering of crates being knocked over. Jake took a step toward Steve, his gun now pointed directly at him, his finger hovering over the trigger. Steve's mind raced. He knew he had seconds, maybe less, before Jake pulled the trigger. Time seemed to slow as he watched Jake's face twist with rage. Just as Jake's finger began to tighten on the trigger, a shot rang out. Jake's eyes widened in shock, and he fell to the ground, his gun clattering to the floor. Steve turned his head to see Tony, his own gun still aimed where Jake had been standing. Tony had acted without hesitation, saving Steve in the split second between life and death. Before Steve could even process what had happened, the doors of the warehouse burst open, and Captain Marcus Thompson's team stormed in. They moved with precision, their shouts filling the space as they ordered everyone to the ground. The sound of boots hitting the concrete, guns being cocked, and men shouting commands filled Steve's senses. He dropped to his knees, raising his hands above his head as Marcus's team swiftly took control of the situation. Jake's men were rounded up, their guns taken, and their hands cuffed behind their backs. The scene was chaotic, but Marcus's team moved like a well-oiled machine, bringing order to the chaos. Steve remained on his knees, his heart still pounding, his mind reeling from how close he had come to death. He looked over at Tony, who gave him a grim nod, his expression unreadable. As the dust began to settle, Marcus approached Steve, his eyes hard but not without a glimmer of something else, perhaps relief. He reached down, helping Steve to his feet. "You did well, Miller," Marcus said, his voice steady. "But remember, this was your last chance. There won't be any more opportunities to prove yourself." Steve nodded, swallowing hard. He knew how close he had come to blowing it all. He knew that Marcus had put his own career on the line by giving him this chance, and he couldn't afford to waste it. The warehouse, now filled with the flashing lights of police cars and the sounds of officers securing the area, felt like a different place entirely. The danger wasn't gone, but for the first time in what felt like forever, Steve felt a sense of purpose. He had survived, barely, but he had done what needed to be done. He had proven himself, not only to Marcus and Tony, but also to himself. As he was led out of the warehouse, Steve's mind raced with everything that had happened. The fear, the tension, the split-second decisions. It had all pushed him to his limits, forcing him to confront parts of himself he wasn't sure he wanted to face. He realized now that the authority he once wielded so carelessly came with a responsibility he hadn't fully understood. It wasn't just about power. It was about protecting people, about making choices that mattered. Tony walked beside him, his face still unreadable, but there was a hint of respect in his eyes that hadn't been there before. "You did good back there," Tony said quietly as they made their way to one of the police vans. "But this isn't over. These guys, they have connections everywhere. They'll come looking for payback." Steve nodded, the weight of Tony's words settling heavily on his shoulders. He knew the danger wasn't over. The mission might have been a success, but the repercussions were only just beginning. Captain Marcus approached them once more, his expression serious. "We're taking you both back to the precinct. We'll debrief, and then you can rest. But Miller," he paused, locking eyes with Steve, "this doesn't mean you're in the clear. You proved yourself tonight, but there's still a long road ahead." Steve met his gaze, determination burning in his eyes. "I understand, sir," he said, his voice steady. Marcus gave a brief nod before turning away, barking orders at his team. As they climbed into the police van, Steve looked out at the warehouse, now a scene of flashing lights and police activity. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. The adrenaline was wearing off, leaving him exhausted but alive. He glanced at Tony, who gave him a nod of acknowledgement. "Get some rest, Miller. You'll need it," Tony said, his voice softer now, almost like a mentor offering advice. Steve leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. The image of Jake, the fury in his eyes just before Tony's shot, flashed in his mind. It could have been him lying there, his life ended in an instant, but it wasn't. He had made it through, and now he had to find a way to move forward. The mission had tested him in ways he never imagined, and it wasn't over yet. The fight for redemption, for a chance to make things right, was just beginning. Returning home, Steve felt like he had lost a part of himself. The mission had taken a toll, and he was beginning to understand the consequences of his past actions. The abuse of power, the discrimination. It had hurt others, but it had also destroyed something inside him. He had once been so sure of himself, so confident in his authority, but now, after facing death and seeing the fragility of his own existence, he realized that he needed to change. His life could no longer be about wielding power recklessly. He needed to learn how to use it responsibly, for the good of others, not for his own ego. The drive home was a quiet one. The streets were mostly empty, the city lights flickering in the distance. Steve gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white as he tried to process everything that had happened. The adrenaline was gone, leaving him with nothing but exhaustion and the hollow realization that he had come so close to losing everything. He pulled into the driveway, staring at the dark windows of his house. He had been avoiding coming home for a while now, not wanting to face the cold reality of the life he had created for himself. Linda, his wife, was waiting for him in the living room when he opened the door. She looked up as he walked in, her face a mixture of concern and something else. Something softer, more forgiving. For the first time in a long time, her eyes weren't cold. Steve hesitated in the doorway, unsure of what to say. He had put her through so much, his arrogance, his mistakes, his detachment. He had pushed her away, and now he wasn't sure how to bring her back. "You're home late," Linda said, her voice gentle. Steve nodded, stepping further into the room, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his shoulders. "Yeah," he replied, his voice rough. He sat down on the couch, rubbing his hands over his face. He felt exhausted, drained in every possible way. Linda watched him for a moment before sitting down beside him, her hand resting on his arm. "I was worried about you," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. Steve looked at her, the guilt hitting him like a punch to the gut. He had spent so much time thinking only of himself, of his own problems, that he had forgotten about the people who cared about him, the people he was supposed to protect. He had been so caught up in his own world that he had failed to see how much his actions affected those around him. "I'm sorry," Steve said, his voice cracking. He looked down at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. I've made a lot of mistakes, Linda. I know that, and I don't know if I can fix everything, but I want to try. I want to be better. Linda's expression softened, and she squeezed his arm gently. I know, Steve, she said. I can see that you're trying, and that's all I need right now. Just try to come back to us, to me, to our family. Steve nodded, his throat tight. He had been so lost, so caught up in his own darkness, that he had forgotten what really mattered. He had been given a second chance, not just by Marcus, but by Linda, by his family. And he wasn't going to waste it. He reached for her hand, holding it tightly. I will, he promised, his voice filled with determination. I will come back. The days that followed were a struggle for Steve. He had to confront the reality of his actions, not just the mission, but everything that had led up to it. He spent hours at the precinct, filling out reports, debriefing with Marcus, and trying to make sense of everything that had happened. Marcus had made it clear that Steve wasn't in the clear yet. He had proven himself. But there was still a long way to go before he could truly redeem himself. At home, things were different too. Steve made an effort to reconnect with Linda, to be present in a way he hadn't been in years. He started helping more around the house, listening when she spoke, really listening, not just pretending to. He realized how much he had taken her for granted, how much he had assumed she would always be there no matter what he did. But now he knew better. He knew that he had to earn her trust back, that he had to prove he was worthy of her love. One evening, as they sat on the back porch, watching the sun set over the city, Linda turned to him. Do you think you'll ever be able to move past this? She asked, her voice filled with concern. Steve was silent for a moment, watching the colors of the sky change, the deep oranges and purples blending together. I don't know, he admitted. I think it's always going to be a part of me. But maybe that's a good thing. Maybe I need to remember it, to keep myself from making the same mistakes again. Linda nodded, her eyes reflecting the fading light. Just don't let it consume you, Steve, she said softly. You're more than the mistakes you've made. I know you are. Steve looked at her, his heart swelling with gratitude. He didn't deserve her forgiveness, but he was going to do everything in his power to be the man she believed he could be. At the precinct, things were different as well. Steve noticed the way his colleagues looked at him, some with respect, others with suspicion. He knew that his reputation had been tarnished, that there were people who doubted him, who wondered if he could really be trusted. And he didn't blame them. He had to prove himself, not just to Marcus or Tony, but to everyone. He had to show that he was more than the arrogant officer he had once been, that he could be someone who truly served and protected. Marcus called Steve into his office one afternoon, his expression unreadable as he gestured for Steve to sit. You've come a long way, Miller, Marcus said, his voice steady. But you're not done yet. There's still a lot of work to be done, and I need to know that I can count on you. Steve met his gaze, determination burning in his eyes. You can, sir, he said firmly. I know I've messed up, but I'm ready to do whatever it takes to make it right. Marcus studied him for a moment before nodding. Good, because this isn't just about you anymore. It's about the people you serve, the people who look to us for protection. We can't afford to let them down. Steve nodded, understanding the weight of Marcus's words. He had been given a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. He was going to prove that he could be the kind of officer who made a difference, who used his power to help, not to harm. As Steve walked out of Marcus's office, he felt a sense of purpose that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy, that there would be challenges and setbacks, but he was ready to face them. He had faced death, faced the darkest parts of himself, and come out the other side. Now it was time to rebuild, to make amends, to become the man he wanted to be, the man his family needed him to be. When Steve got home that night, he found Linda in the kitchen, cooking dinner. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist and resting his head on her shoulder. She smiled, leaning back into him. How was your day? She asked. Steve closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. It was good, he said, his voice filled with a quiet determination. I'm getting there. One step at a time. Linda turned in his arms, looking up at him. That's all we can do, she said, her voice soft. One step at a time, and for the first time in a long time, Steve felt like that might just be enough. The story of Steve Miller is a profound lesson about the abuse of power and its consequences. When someone uses their authority to belittle others, they risk losing their own humanity and values. Steve paid a heavy price for his arrogance and prejudice, but ultimately, he realized that change was necessary if he wanted to live a more meaningful life. Steve's journey was not an easy one. He had to face the darkest parts of himself, confront the harm he had done to others, and find a way to make amends. It was a painful process, but it was also transformative. He learned that true power lies not in domination, but in serving and protecting others with compassion and integrity. As Steve worked to rebuild his life, he understood that respect is a right that everyone deserves, regardless of who they are or where they come from. He realized that judging people based on their appearance or background only leads to division and pain. Every individual has a story, and it's important to see beyond the surface to understand who they truly are. In the end, Steve's story is a reminder to all of us. Power is not meant to be abused. It is meant to protect and serve the community. The choices we make, especially those in positions of authority, have far-reaching consequences. We must choose to use our power for good, to uplift rather than to tear down, respect others, listen to their stories, and never judge someone by their appearance. You never know the battles they've fought or the strength it took for them to be where they are today. Let Steve Miller's journey be a beacon, guiding us to be better, to treat others with dignity, and to use whatever power we have for the greater good. If you enjoyed this story, please like the video, share your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to Life Story 999 for more meaningful stories.